Hello, welcome back to another video. This week I tried a new watercolor technique, adapted my methods to fit dry weather, and talked about modifying a reference photo to better suit your needs, all while continuing to test the Derwent Drawing Pencils and Daniel Smith Essentials set of watercolors. Let's get started. The supplies I used included Arches 100% cotton hot press watercolor paper, the Faber-Castell Polychromos 12 pencil set, a Mars Lumograph HB pencil, a Tombow mono ultra fine eraser, a paper blending stump, the Derwent Drawing Pencil set in earth red, a white Jellyroll gel pen, a white acrylic POSCA paint pen, and Daniel Smith's Watercolor Essentials 6-color set. My first step was to transfer my sketch onto the Arches watercolor paper using a light box. This minimizes the amount of erasing I do and preserves the paper's texture. As tempting as it was to recreate every detail, I only focused on major landmarks like the facial features and placement of the shoulders. After taping the paper down to my desk, I started by laying a flat wash of warm brown over the entire study, excluding the white areas. From the angle I placed the camera, the hands looked disproportionately large, even though they were the correct size in the original sketch. This is a dramatic illustration of how perspective can skew our perception of proportions, and why I like to sketch at an angle. Sketching on an angled surface reduces this perspective warping. Anyway, after that layer dried, I began laying down the lightest values of the figure's skin on her arms. I normally like to tackle the skin all at once, but I decided to break it up this time. This was helpful since it's been bone dry where I live. Instead of the normal April showers, we have fire watches from unusually hot weather and humidity in the teens. The air made the paints dry incredibly quickly and created unwanted hard edges in my initial wash. By focusing on a smaller area, I hoped I could give myself enough time to soften edges before they dried. While I was happier with the results I was getting, it was mentally more taxing. Why? Normally, when I render, I like to work on everything at the same time, at least for the first few layers. This way, I can judge my values and colors based on their relative position and comparison to their surroundings. I couldn't do that when nothing else was painted, so I had to try to block out everything else and just focus on the arms in the reference photo. I know some hyper-realistic artists will paint inch by inch and only look at that bit of reference, but I'm not used to this way of rendering. A couple years ago, this mental fatigue from a new way of observing things would have frustrated me. Luckily, I knew why I was more tired, and I was willing to give myself breaks in between layers. I continued working this way until I finally gave in and laid down the base color for the hair. My perception of the study completely shifted after doing this. This is an illustration of why value is so important in paintings. It affects how we perceive things and can either help or hinder our progress. In this case, adding the darker value to the hair helped frame the face and showed me how much contrast I could still add to this area. However, I still had a problem. If you look off to the side, you can see my thumbnail studies. This time, I couldn't find a satisfying way to render the background, so I had to wing it on the final study. Normally, I would use wet on wet to create a soft, diffuse wash here, but I was afraid to do that. Red and green are complementary colors, or opposite to each other on the color wheel. When mixed together, they inevitably create brown, which I wanted to avoid. In retrospect, I think I should have just bit the bullet and used wet on wet anyways. It would have saved me time later in the process when I was trying to make the flowers feel like they were part of the foliage instead of pasted on top. At this point, I was finally ready to paint the face. I'll admit, I was avoiding this area because of my nerves. I wanted to try something new, and I wasn't sure if it was going to ruin things. Normally, when I soften edges, I use the same brush I used to lay down the color. But after watching some professional watercolorists, I decided to use a separate brush for this. It makes sense in theory. When I blend with color pencil, I use either a tissue or a blending stump. The second brush plays this role here, with the added benefit of conserving pigment I would have washed from the original brush to clean it. I'm happy to say that this two-brush method worked wonderfully. I'm especially pleased with the soft gradient from light to dark on the cheeks. I'll link the watercolorists in the description below, but if you want to search for them yourself, they're Denise Soden and Emily Olson here on YouTube. I adore both of their work, and often have their videos up in the background when painting or sketching. Anyway, after this, I continued painting with gradually darker layers. Another dramatic demonstration of the importance of value came when I finally filled in the brows, lips, and hair shadows. Suddenly, her facial features came alive. I could see where I still needed contrast and where to push the saturation. The rest of the rendering process became a slow and deliberate process of layering darker values and defining form. I hopped around the study to give areas time to dry. After one last deepening layer on the background, I called it done. This is my favorite watercolor phase of a study to date. There were still issues and things I would do differently, but I'm glad I was able to successfully use a new technique and render with more precision and detail than I have in the past. Moving on to the dry media phase, I untaped the study and set it at an angle to reduce the perspective warp I mentioned in the beginning. Sometimes I start with the background, but this time I chose to start with the focal point, the face. This area lost some of its definition during the watercolor phase, so I redefined the planes and added saturation using a mixture of warm browns, oranges, and reds. One of the biggest changes I made was to her mouth. At some point, the mouth shrank and widened in one of the watercolor phases, so I corrected this with my opaque Derwent Drawing Pencils and the POSCA paint pen. I tried to keep in mind the 3D form of the mouth as it stretches and curves across the face. This results in a gradual deepening of value in the corners as they curve away from the viewer. Once I was happy with the face, I moved on to the hair. The dark values I laid down provided a solid base to pick out highlights from. I used Derwent's brown ochre, sanguine, and sepia red for this step. It would have been easy to over-detail since the original reference photo captures a myriad of small strands of hair. I didn't want to distract from the face, so I kept most of the detail in my study at the transition points and highlights. The shadows gently faded away into the background with only a hint of definition. From there, it was a relatively simple and repetitive process of rendering, stepping back to assess the overall study, and then rendering some more. The combination of polychromos and Derwent Drawing Pencils continued to impress me. I was able to create smooth, opaque layers with the Derwent pencils, and then add fine details with the polychromos on top. The earthy, warm colors in my limited Derwent set complemented the figure's skin and allowed me to add some much-needed contrast to the shadow areas. At last, it was time to tackle the background. Remember when I said I wished I unified the leaves and flowers? Yeah, it was time to do that. Like with the hair, I wanted to minimize the excessive detail to keep the piece from feeling too busy. This involved lots of squinting and stepping back as I laid down the shadows of the leaves using a combination of Derwent Chocolate and Polychromos Phthalo Blue, Emerald Green, Magenta, Walnut Brown, and Black. For the highlights, I used the opaque Derwent Chinese White softened with Polychromos Light Ultramarine. After covering the foliage, I tackled the flowers. In the photo, these are a bright, saturated fuchsia color, but I decided to tone this down in my study. As lovely as the original colors are, I felt they distracted from the focal point. This had the added benefit of meshing the flowers into the foliage, which was also less detailed and vibrant than in the original photo. Adding magenta to the edges finally created the soft, out-of-focus effect I was aiming for. To hint at the suggestion of detail, I dotted the POSCA paint pen on the highlights and quickly dabbed at the paint while it was still wet. After softening these areas with yet more red, I decided the study was finally finished. Here is the final study. This might be my favorite study I've done so far, and I'm happy I was able to document the process for you. Here's a time-lapse version for those of you that made it all the way to this point. I'm glad I was able to successfully use a new two-brush technique and to try the Daniel Smith watercolors a second time. The paints reactivated beautifully when dry and allowed me to focus on my technique instead of worrying about how the paint behaved. Like I've mentioned before, the mark of a great supply, at least for me, is when I forget about it and can focus on other things. My fondness for the Derwent Drawing Pencils also continues to grow. Even though they can't replace my Polychromos, they fill their own niche by being opaque and easy to blend. I would like to pick up more colors in the future, but for now, I'm happy with this limited set. Anyway, as always, I hope you enjoyed this video and that you created something that brought you joy this week. I'll see you next Friday with a new video. Bye!